Coming up, the Nets effectively solidify their draft lottery odds with 2 straight wins, and rumors continue to circulate about their future plans involving one of the NBA's top names. I'll react to all that and more after this. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast and the Believe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Before we get into today's topics, if you don't already, make sure you subscribe to Believe in Nets. Go to my YouTube channel, Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe if you enjoy this content. Hit the like button if you're watching on YouTube right now. Hit that like button. Only leaves a second. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about anything I say, any questions you have about the team situation or things that I discuss. Only takes a second. Really appreciate it. It helps to, drive engagement and build this channel as I'm trying to do towards the end of this season. But on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Nets draft lottery position, which has been, if not the main subject, one of the main subjects of this entire season, all but solidified. It looks like they are going to be in the 6th draft lottery odds spot. So we're going to talk about how we got there, what that means. We're also going to be talking about one unlikely Nets storyline at the end of the season with Timme receiving a call-up from the G League and some of the things that he's been able to do. I'll touch on that briefly. Then we're going to get into some reports that the Nets have some big plans involving one Giannis Antetokounmpo potentially after this season, and we'll talk about how a potential trade could work out and whether or not that should be an avenue that they should be pursuing. But talking about the Nets draft lottery position, they've been in a tank race with the 76ers and with the Raptors. They lost to the Raptors last week, which effectively solidified their place ahead of them. And then it was really just between them and the 76ers for this 5th draft lottery spot. And the Sixers, as everyone knows, have been shamelessly tanking, extremely egregious stuff. Honestly, embarrassing given, where their season was supposed to go and some of the things that have transpired there. But it really made it seem like it was going to be tough for the Nets to leap them. It seemed like tying them might have been the most realistic possibility if both the teams just lost out. But then the Nets turn around and they put together back-to-back wins against the Washington Wizards on Saturday, and last night beat the Dallas Mavericks, who had Anthony Davis and Daniel Gafford and some of their top players active, were able to just outperform those guys down the stretch with really just an assortment of players that you wouldn't think would be able to compete with guys like Anthony Davis. So, unlikely development, but the Nets win 2 straight. They're effectively now locked into those 6th draft lottery odds, 6th place. They're 1.5 games behind the 76ers in 5th and 3.5 ahead of the Raptors with 6 games remaining. So catching the 76ers seems pretty much impossible with the way that they're playing. It doesn't seem like they're going to win another game. And with 6 remaining, they're not going to fall behind the Raptors. So they're in 6th. That's where it lands. And before I talk about how they got there, opinions of that, of how they've handled the tank this whole season, just what the odds of that 6th spot entail, I'm going to pull them up actually here because I have a picture that tells you kind of how all this could go. So you see here on this chart, the odds that you get in that 6th spot, it's pretty much evenly split across the first 4 picks is 9% each. So that's about a 37% chance that the Nets could pick in the top 4. There's no chance that they pick 5th, and then about 9% chance that they could pick 6th. And then the likeliest spot is actually 7th or 8th. If you look at the odds there, it's 29.7 in 7th and 20.5 in 8th. So that's about a 50% chance that the Nets are going to be picking in one of those 2 spots, 7th or 8th. So the most likely outcome for the Nets is that they're either jumping into the top 4, I said 37% chance there, or they're picking 7th or 8th, 50% chance that they're in one of those 2 spots. So it's not improbable they can move up. The NBA went to this system where you can see the odds are flattening a lot more to try to dissuade tanking and to try to add more parity to the lottery so that teams have a better chance to move up, and teams can move up. Like we saw it, last year, obviously, with the Atlanta Hawks. We've seen some other teams at the top of the draft fall, like the Detroit Pistons fell to 5th, but the odds are the odds. If you're a math person, these are the probabilities, and it doesn't really matter what's happened before or what's happened after. This is the probability the Nets have. So top 4, 37%. 7th or 8th, 50%. That's the way that I would be looking at this for the Nets. And, I want to talk a little bit about how the Nets got here. And I want to preface this by saying that they can obviously still get lucky. As I just said, the Nets can get lucky. They can go up to the top 4 spots. They can get the number 1 pick. It's definitely not out of the range of possibilities, but it's much more likely that they are going to be picking 7th or 8th. And if you would have told us before this season that they were going to end up with the 7th or 8th pick, I think a lot of people would have said that that's a disaster. Asked, how did that happen? What went wrong? Something insane must have developed, because it was obviously an expectation that this was going to be a tanking season for the Nets after the moves that they made, after, trading what was essentially 4 picks for 2 to get their first round pick this year and next year from the Houston Rockets. And I want to be clear, the Nets have tanked. They've definitely tanked this season, but there's tanking and then there's tanking, shamelessly tanking. Like some of these teams at the top of the draft lottery odds, the Wizards, the Hornets, the Jazz, now the 76ers and the Pelicans are joining that race. Those teams are shamelessly tanking this season, and the Nets just haven't done that. And the preseason win projections for the Nets, which were 18.5 wins at one point, it was the lowest that they've had in 30 years, were set under the expectation that they were going to shamelessly tank based on the markup that they paid to the Houston Rockets to get back their first round pick this year. You don't make that move unless you are going to go all in on a tank and try to maximize that asset. That was the discourse and, the opinion within NBA circles entering the season after the Nets made that trade with the Rockets, was they did this. They're going to go all in on a tank. They're going to maximize their chances at trying to get a player like Cooper Flag. And they just haven't done it. Like I've said, they've tanked, but they haven't done it to that level. They've held out. They held their top 3 veterans, Cam Johnson, Dennis Schroeder, Dorian Finney-Smith, well into the season. They didn't trade them in the offseason. They obviously got off to that 9-10 start, which really put them behind the 8 ball, from which they really haven't been able to recover. Obviously, CJ is still here. They never even moved off him. They've rested guys late in the year, but it hasn't been egregious, sitting guys every night, resting some of the top players often, the way that Utah and the way that Charlotte and some of these other teams have done. And when these guys are active, whether it's Cam Johnson or now D'Angelo Russell or whoever you want to talk about, the Nets aren't benching their starters in the fourth quarter like these other teams are, like what Toronto has done. It's been very egregious. What the Wizards did on Saturday against the Nets, they benched Jordan Poole, Alex Sarr, Bub Carrington, all these guys were sitting down the stretch of the fourth quarter, and the Nets had Cam Johnson and these other guys that were starting for them in the game. So those starters for the Nets, those guys who can play competent basketball, aren't sitting down the stretch. When guys are active, they're playing, they're coaching to win. And clearly there's been a directive from some of these other teams, whether it's the Jazz, whether it's the Raptors, whether it's the Wizards, obviously the 76ers. Now, even in-game decisions, they're benching these guys down the stretch. There's clear alignment from ownership to the front office, to the coaching staff, with how decisions are made before games and then during the games when guys are available. And with the Nets, I also think there's been alignment, and that alignment has just been that they're not going to shamelessly tank. They're not going to handicap themselves during games. They're going to play who is ever available, and they're going to do their best to win. I actually agree with that. I don't think that you should put a coach in a position, I've said this throughout the season, where he has to bench guys during a game. I think management, in the front office and ownership has to put it, take it upon themselves if they want to lose and egregiously tank the way some of these other teams have, to make these guys, not available on a nightly basis, to handicap the roster however they can beforehand. So the Nets just haven't done the shameless tank up to this point. There's 6 games left. They're not going to do it. They have tanked. It just hasn't been at the level of some of these other teams. And you may agree with that. You may not agree with it. It has resulted in them getting these 6 draft lottery odds instead of a top 4 slot. And when you ask yourself, what is with this refusal to shamelessly tank? Why are they doing this? And I say, I think some of it is obviously tied to building a culture, not setting a precedent that losing is okay, or that we're trying to handicap you, because it is difficult. No team wants to tank. It's unfortunately the way that the NBA has set it up, and it's incentivized, and there's not really a lot of great solutions. I might talk about it on an upcoming episode, overall big picture of what tanking is like in the NBA, but nobody wants to lose, but it's a reality that a lot of teams feel that they have to do. And it's very difficult to establish a culture and establish, a way of, what you're trying to preach to these players in terms of the habits that you're trying to build. And then you're handicapping them on a nightly basis. It's very hypocritical. But I think a lot of these tanking teams think that a lot of the players that they have aren't going to be on the team in the long run, and they just need to do this to get these star guys. Because if you don't get star talent in the NBA, you have no chance to win, no chance to compete. You need that high-end guys. And if you're not a big market team like the Nets or some of these other teams, or even if you are, a really primary way to get those guys is through getting a top draft pick and drafting them at the top of the draft, obviously. So obviously, I said, I think the Nets, some of it's tied to building the culture. They don't want to shamelessly tank and do all that. I think some of it's perception based, them not wanting to be viewed in the same ilk as these tanking teams, whether it's the Hornets or the Jazz or the Wizards, maybe by prospective stars they might want to go after via trade or free agency. They don't want to be lumped in with those guys. But that whole thought process of, not wanting to settle for a losing culture, or not wanting to be viewed in the same ilk as these tanking teams, so we're not going to shamelessly tank. That just doesn't make much sense to me, because the Nets are tanking. They are tanking, since they've traded those guys, since they've traded Dennis Schroeder, since they traded Dorian Finney-Smith, they are tanking. They're just half-assing it. So I don't really think you're accomplishing anything by not going all in on the tank. You're either doing it or you're not, in my opinion. And the way that they've done it is like, what are we going to remember in 5-10 years? Are the Nets going to be remembered as an organization of they really didn't shamelessly tank in that season, and they got the 6th best draft lottery odds instead of a top 4 spot, and they played these guys in the fourth quarter down the stretch of games, and they didn't sit these guys, and all these things. Are we going to remember that, or are you going to remember more who gets Cooper Flagg, who gets Dylan Harper? These stars, when we're talking about perception based, of the Nets not wanting to be viewed as some of these other in the same ilk as some of these other teams potentially. Do stars really care? Stars want to win. And maybe, by the Nets playing some of these guys and exceeding expectations a little bit and generating whatever minuscule buzz they did, maybe stars do notice that. At the end of the day, I think stars are looking at the market they're going to be playing in, they're looking at the players that are going to be next to them, and they're looking at, obviously, the assets that the team has to spend. And if the Nets were to get a top pick, and the Nets were to get Cooper Flagg or whatever else they could get in this draft, I think that that's more attractive than whatever perceived culture or competency they think that you might be getting by not shamelessly tanking the way that some of these other teams are. So that's just the way that I've seen it. A lot of you might disagree with me. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, obviously. It's a very subjective thing. It's very opinion-based. I hate the fact that we have to talk about this. I've hated talking about it this season because it's just not the way that you want to, cover or, talk about sports, view sports. You want to watch teams that are trying to win. Every team should be trying to win. But unfortunately, the way that the NBA is laid out, there is an incentive for these teams to lose. And that is an unfortunate reality that they have to go through to try to get top talent. So it's just how I see it. The Nets have the 6th best odds. We'll see how the lottery balls shake out, how the ping pong balls fly, and maybe they get lucky, maybe they don't. Either way, I think there's going to be, a lot of opinions continued about this until that draft lottery night amongst the Nets fan base. But moving on, I want to talk quickly about Drew Timme, who actually got called up from the Long Island Nets. Obviously was having, a monster month with the Nets, had that 50-point game down in Long Island a few weeks ago, was averaging 27 points a game for an extended stretch there, just shooting it from 3 really well, shooting it from the field really well, all that. And then he gets the call up, gets a 2-year contract. I think the Nets haven't released the terms of the deal, but I think it's safe to assume that the second year of that is partially guaranteed or a team option. But he's on the team the rest of this year. It's his first NBA opportunity. Obviously, a star at Gonzaga. A lot of people, watched him in the NCAA tournament, and he just hasn't caught on. He was with the Bucks G League affiliate. He was with the Kings G League affiliate to start this season, and the Nets traded for him in December, sent Amari Bailey to the Stockton Kings to get Timme, and he's been outstanding. I mean, he started shooting his 3-point shot. He started, kind of changing his post-up heavy style of play and adapting more to, I think, what NBA front offices are looking for. And he had success with it in Long Island. He's gotten the opportunity, and he's been pretty effective in these 3 games that he's played with the Nets. He's had 13 points per game, 6.3 rebounds, and 1.7 assists, shooting 61% from the field in 25 minutes per game. And he's been able to hang with some of these NBA-level guys. We saw them in the second half of this game last night. Timme had 6 points in the fourth quarter, and I wrote about it. Anthony Davis, PJ Washington, Spencer Dinwiddie, and Klay Thompson combined for 4 points in the fourth quarter. So Timme outscored all 4 of them. And, he has some NBA skills. Obviously, he has skills as a post-up guy. That's what he did at Gonzaga. He's crafty around the rim. He can finish. He can position himself. He can post up smaller guys. but he also has some other skills as a short roll passer and playmaker. He started shooting some threes. The Nets have run some really cool sets for him where they've been running some inverted pick and roll stuff with him as a ball handler to try to get him switched on the guards where he can post up. They've even run some actions to set up 3-point shots for him. And he's just been playing extremely hard. And I think it's cool to see a guy like this get his NBA opportunity and really take advantage of it. And he's just a really funny dude. Like, all the times that we've gotten to talk to him in the media, which is just a handful thus far, he seems extremely appreciative of the opportunity. He's very candid and funny. And maybe that's just because he's only been in the NBA literally for a few days. And once he gets longer, he'll get the media training and all that. But it's just been fun to talk to him. It's been fun to see him get this opportunity. And it's been a little bit of a fun storyline at the end of a Nets season that has been otherwise obviously kind of downtrodden and just stuck in this tank conversation and tank misery. To see Timme come up and get a shot, and I'm not going to discount him as a player that potentially could stick in the NBA long term, because as I said, he has those skills, being able to post up mismatches, being able to be a short roll playmaker. Obviously, it will depend on him developing the 3-point shot because he has some of those limitations as not a lob threat, doesn't have a lot of vertical pop, not going to protect the rim. If he can really lean into and develop those offensive skills of his game of, being potential floor spacer, short roll playmaker, using those post up skills when called upon, maybe he could stick as a backup center in this league. He's a very high IQ player. He hustles. He seems to be about all the right things. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to Drew Timme. I think it's been really cool to watch him play. Going to take a quick break now. When I come back, I'm going to be talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo and whether he should potentially be a trade target for the Nets this offseason amid some reports from one of my colleagues on the Nets beat. So I'll talk about that after a quick break. Coming back from the break, I want to talk now about Giannis Antetokounmpo and his links to the Nets in this whole season, frankly. But last night, Brian Lewis, New York Post, colleague of mine, friend of the pod, put out another report that Giannis is the Nets' plan A, and that's what league personnel have intimated to him. Throughout this season, he was just kind of reporting it again and putting it fresh in the mind, obviously, of Nets fans and everyone, that Giannis is a guy that the Nets are holding out for, that the Nets want to pursue, and that he's a potential plan for him this summer or next or whenever he potentially moves on from the Milwaukee Bucks, if he does move on from the Milwaukee Bucks. So I think this has been known for a while. It's no secret within, the NBA world that the Nets have a desire to go big game hunting. And if you're looking at the realistic guys who could be on the move, who are, that 1A type player where there's really only 8, 9 of those guys in the whole NBA, if that. Giannis is the only one who could very realistically be available. So it's been known that the Nets could go after him. I just want to talk a little bit about it now because a lot of our fans are reacting to the report that Brian put out last night. So kind of wanted to break this up into a few segments to kind of, have this conversation in a way that it really breaks down all the elements of it from the Nets perspective. First, I want to talk about, is Giannis even going to get traded? Because a lot of these times these conversations happen. Giannis's future has been a subject for the last 3 years since the Bucks won the title in 2021. They've struggled since then, and he's still on the team. So is he finally going to get traded? When you look at the Bucks and the situation that they're in, they obviously beat the Nets on the way to that title in 2021, but then they lost in the second round in 2022, and they lost in the first round the last 2 seasons with Giannis obviously battling some injuries going into the playoffs. But it looks like it's heading a similar direction this season. They're 4-9 over their last 13 games, and Damian Lillard is out indefinitely due to a blood clot. Obviously hope that, he gets well. That's something that we've seen with some other NBA players, and it's terrible. That's actually been, the state of the Bucks and the way that they've struggled this season. They've kind of been a roller coaster. It's been good for the Nets because they own their draft pick as part of the Mikal Bridges trade. They got it back, and it's looking like that pick is going to land 17th, which is a massive win for the Nets because a lot of people assumed with the Bucks roster that pick was going to be in the mid to late 20s. And I think I said before the season that I viewed 19 as probably the best case scenario for the Nets. So for the Bucks to get all the way to 17, there's been some injury luck or poor luck on their part, luck for the Nets, some suspensions. Bobby Portis has been out, and also they're just not a great team, honestly. But it's worked out for the Nets where they're going to get close to a lottery pick. I mean, potentially they could package that with the Knicks pick or the Rockets pick to move up into the late lottery. So big win for the Nets there. But overall, the Bucks aren't a championship team this season. I think it would be one of the biggest surprises in NBA history if they made a run to the finals this year and got through the Celtics or the Cavs or whoever else you want to talk about. And then when you're talking about the situation moving forward with what it looks like for them, The Bucks have no cap space. They have no intriguing young prospects to trade. They only have one tradable first-round pick in 2031. And then you look at the contracts that they have on the books. Damian Lillard's owed $113 million over the next 2 seasons. He's going to be 35 next season, so he's not a bad player, obviously, by any means. Still a very good player, but I don't think that contract is going to age well. And then you look at the rest of their supporting cast, which is headlined by Brook Lopez, Kyle Kuzma, Bobby Portis. The guys they have under contract, they're far from championship caliber, and they just don't have really any avenues to reshuffle this roster. Like you could say they have they could have the non-taxpayer mid-level exception this offseason, which is $14 million. They have that 2031 first-round pick, but is that going to upgrade this roster to a point where it's championship caliber? I just don't see it. I don't think anybody else in the NBA sees it. And that's why the conversation surrounding Giannis has just, continued and persisted through all of this. And Giannis has said that he will leave if he feels that he has a better chance to win a title elsewhere. He's emphasized that that's really all that matters to him is winning the championship. And he's ready to go if he doesn't feel that the Bucks are giving him the best opportunity. And at this point, based on everything I just outlined, I don't think anybody would say that the Bucks give Giannis the best chance to win a championship. So because of that, I think there's a very realistic chance that Giannis is on the move this summer, if not at next year's trade deadline, somewhere in the near future. Next question tied to this: would he want to come to the Nets? Now, I just said winning a championship, Giannis has said it's the main priority. There are other places where Giannis will have a better chance to win a title, whether you want to talk about the Thunder, the Spurs, the Rockets, any of these teams with draft picks or intriguing young pieces to trade who have better infrastructures and cores right now. Far better chances to win for Giannis. Question is, would those teams want to go all in for him? Would he want to go there? How much does he value playing in New York City? Because obviously the Nets always have a leg up in these situations just based on being in the New York market, the business opportunities, the publicity, all that's tied to that, the lifestyle. So that's going to be a factor, obviously. How much is he balancing? How much he's prioritizing playing in a big market, which he's been in Milwaukee his whole career. So we'll see. Is that something that he finally wants to do? Get out of a small town like that and play in New York City. Also, how much leverage does Giannis have in negotiations? Because he just signed an extension that has 3 years left after this season. So the Bucks don't have to trade him to any one place. Like, this isn't going to be a situation where he says, this is what I want to go to the Nets or I want to go to the Thunder and I'm not going to play anywhere else. He obviously has some leverage and he can influence how much teams want to offer him by, intimating whether or not he'd be happy there and whether or not that's his main choice. But we just saw this play out with Damian Lillard, with these guys who sign extensions and then try to get traded. They have some leverage. I think Giannis will have more leverage than Dame did, but it's ultimately, going to come down to Milwaukee getting the best package that they can. And I think that, it's going to come down to whether Giannis obviously wants to be in a big market, how much he's willing to push, how does he feel good about the Nets assets, all those things. So I think the Nets would definitely be in play, but it's just a question, I think, of, is he prioritizing the market? Is he prioritizing winning a championship at all costs? How much are the Nets willing to offer? All these factors are going to influence it. Now, lastly, should the Nets want to trade for Giannis? Obviously, this has been a conversation dating back to, I think, last offseason. There's been rumblings about this. And if you look at Giannis, the player right now, he's still playing at an MVP level. I'd say he's a top 4 or 5 player, alongside SGA, Jokic, Luka, whoever else you want to put in that category. He's up there. He's one of those 1A guys that you need to contend for a championship. He's averaging 30 points per game this season, 12 rebounds, 6 assists, 1.2 blocks, shooting 60% from the field. There's really shifted his game away from, not that he was ever a heavy three-point shooter, but he doesn't really take any threes anymore. It's much more mid-range and going to the basket. So he's playing at an MVP level. He's going to be 31 next season. And when you look at the Nets, assets, and the reason they're able to be in this conversation is that they have 13 first-round picks and over $50 million in cap space. That's both top in the league. That gives them this rebuild optionality that I've talked about this whole season, of where they can build through the draft, but if a star of their liking comes available, they can pivot and try to trade for that person. And Giannis, based on reports from Brian and everybody else, in the league, seems to think this. Giannis is the guy that would be that guy that could make them pivot. So when you're talking about, is this a wise path for the Nets to go? You look at the current core that the Nets have, I'd say that it's Cam Johnson, Cam Thomas, and Nick Claxton. Like, those are the 3 core guys. They have other guys, obviously, who can play. We'll see what happens with D'Angelo Russell's future. They have Day'Ron Sharpe. They have some of these younger guys, but Cam Johnson, Cam Thomas, Nick Claxton, top 3 guys. I think that it would be safe to assume that the Nets would have to include, 2 of those 3 guys or multiple of those guys, plus 4 or 5 first-round picks, plus swaps, whatever you want to say, to get a player of Giannis's caliber who is still in his prime. So at that point, if you're trading, multiple of Cam Johnson, Cam Thomas, Nick Claxton, plus 4 or 5 first plus swaps, at that point, you'd really be a blank canvas. Like, you'll have some picks left over. As I said, the Nets have 13 tradable first-round picks. You'll have some cap space because, they could have up to $65 million in cap space this offseason. You'll have Giannis in the New York market to pitch other stars on, but you're still several moves away from building a contender. As I said, you're really building this from scratch. You'll have Giannis. Maybe you have one of those core guys left over. You have Day'Ron, or you could bring back D'Lo or whoever else, but you're going to need to bring in a second star. You're going to need to bring in the rest probably of most of the rest of your starting unit and rotation. And in this new CBA that, has its own constraints, there's basically a hard cap in this new CBA with the second apron. It was put in to prevent these big market teams with these rich owners like the Nets or the Clippers with Steve Ballmer or the Lakers, whoever you want to say. It was put in to prevent these teams from being able to just spend and spend and spend and really have that competitive advantage. So this isn't like the KD, Kyrie, Harden era where Joe Tsai can just spend as much money as he wants and keep adding to the team and adding to the team. This second apron changes a lot of all that, and it makes it a lot harder to build these teams, through trades where you're acquiring these veteran superstars and trying to put together these teams on the fly. It's much easier to build teams through the draft nowadays, and that's just the way that the league is set up now. Now, does that mean that you can't do it? No. Like, you could absolutely build a team, on the fly like this if you make shrewd moves and are able to do these things, but it's just a lot more difficult than it used to be. So, when you're talking about what the Nets are going to have to trade for Giannis, I said multiple, core pieces and then 4 or 5 first-round picks plus swaps. When you look at what they'd be left with, Giannis and that remaining flexibility, is that enough to build a title team? And how long is that window? As I said, Giannis is going to be 31 this season. He plays an extremely physical brand of basketball. He has added a jumper. He doesn't shoot from 3 as much, but his mid-range jumper's got much better throughout his career. He's added other things to his game. But I think that it's fair to be concerned, obviously, about how his game is going to age, because it's very reliant on physical dominance and him being able to play at that level. And I also think, conversely, it's fair to say that players nowadays are playing longer than they ever have before. The medicine, the physical therapy, the training is all at a higher level than it ever has been before. And it's also fair to say that this guy's nickname, he's a physical freak. His nickname is literally the Greek Freak. And he's extremely committed, obviously, to playing basketball. It's his whole life. So I'm not going to put a cap on how long Giannis can play at this level, but I do think that it's fair to be concerned about trading for a guy who's 31 years old, is extremely, reliant on physical dominance and athleticism. There's not as much finesse to his game. How that's going to age? Is it just a 2, 3, 4-year title window? That's a really realistic concern. And then also, I think that there's obviously just an opportunity cost associated with trading for Giannis. And I think that it's arguably the most important part of this conversation, because it seemed like the Nets had a clear direction after they traded Mikal Bridges and sent what was basically, as I said, 4 first-round picks to the Rockets to get their 2025 and 2026 first back. And that direction was tank for 2 years to get top picks in these stacked draft classes. And they didn't do a great job of that this year. Obviously, as I said several times, they can still get lucky in the lottery, but they haven't optimized that. But that might be okay because, obviously you want to optimize it no matter what. But you look at next year's draft class, and a lot of NBA people think the top of next year's draft class is even better and more highly regarded than this year's. You have guys like Darren Peterson, AJ DeBansta, Cam Boozer, all these guys were just at the Nets practice facility practicing for the McDonald's All-American game and are going to be at Barclays for McDonald's. So if you're a Nets fan, you should definitely check that out and see those guys play. But as I said, it's an opportunity cost, and trading for Giannis would not only take you out of the running for one of those guys because you're not going to be going for a lottery pick at all that point. It would also require you to part with a huge chunk of your assets. So it's extremely risky, in my opinion, to trade for a guy who's Giannis's age, to try to put a team together on the fly in this new CBA, to pass at a chance to organically build through the draft, really for the first time ever, because I've talked about it throughout this season that this is a Nets franchise, a Nets fan base that has never seen a homegrown star in the history of its franchise. I said it's been 2010 was the last time the Nets picked in the lottery. Derek Favors, he missed out on John Wall. Obviously, Derek Favors was not a star player. You go back beyond that, we're talking Brooke Lopez, Kenyon Martin, Derek Coleman. I've said this so many times, but it's really just crazy that this team has never had a homegrown superstar. And if you're talking about trying to build sustainable success, which is something that Sean Marks has said when he's talked to the media several times since making the Mikal Bridges and Houston Rockets trades. We want to build this out sustainably. We want to have sustainable success. Is trading for Giannis a better path to building sustainable success than, going the homegrown route, trying to build it through the draft with multiple high-end young guys, and then using the assets, the draft picks, the cap space from there to kind of build forward through that? I think one of those is clearly a more sustainable and better path than the other. And also, if you're trying to get a fan base invested, like we saw the Nets with KD, with Kyrie, with James Harden, they were hot for a second there. Obviously, people cared. There were some fans who came, but there's a lot of stan culture nowadays. Like when those guys left, are those fans still here? Did the Nets grow their fan base by having those guys on the team? Like, I definitely think it made them a little more relevant to be associated with those guys, but I wouldn't say the fan base grew a ton. And if you're talking about potentially going in on a guy like Giannis again for a quick fix, it's probably only going to be a few years that he would be on the team, as opposed to trying to get one of these top guys. This year it would have been Cooper Flagg. It could still be, but next year, Darren Peterson, DeBansta, Boozer, these guys who can be homegrown superstars who could be with your team for a decade plus. That is a much higher ceiling, in my opinion, in terms of the fan base and getting people invested in the team and keeping them invested and being relevant for a long time. Look at the Warriors. Obviously, they did it with later draft picks, but they got Curry, they got Thompson. They've grown themselves into one of the best brands in the NBA. And I think that a move for Giannis at this point, I could be wrong. It could lead to a championship. That Sean Marks could make some great shrewd moves. Giannis could recruit. They could do all these things to put the team together on the fly. But in my opinion, it's just short-sighted. It's something the Nets have done a lot. And in this situation, given what they have, which is their own draft picks and potential to rebuild through the draft, which is something they didn't have when they got KD and Kyrie and Harden, this situation, I think it's very clear what is the more sustainable path, which path makes more sense, which path honestly has higher long-term upside and could lead to you building a brand and a fan base that you could see growing, over the next decade plus. So obviously a lot's going to transpire before these conversations, any answers reveal themselves. We still have the playoffs. We'll see how the Bucks finish up. We have the lottery. We'll see what picks the Nets get. All those things are going to heavily influence this outcome, but just wanted to give my take on this, and might go through a longer episode where I'll try to have Brian or somebody else on as a guest, to maybe even some Nets fans, to chop it up and see what everybody's opinion is on this, because, it is where we are talking about acquiring a player like Giannis Antetokounmpo, who is a top 4 player in the NBA in his prime. So it might be crazy to some people to hear a team like the Nets not want him, but I think it's a very nuanced conversation. I think that there's a very good case for not doing it. And I also do think there could be a case for doing it. So we'll talk about all that as we get into the offseason and all that progresses. But that does it for this episode of Believe in Nets here on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. As I said at the top, if you do not already, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Like it. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about how the Nets tank transpired this year, the way that they've handled it. Let me know what you think about the Giannis situation and what that could potentially look like. Let me know what you think. If you have any Drew Timme takes, Timme time, fire those off in the comments. Anything you can do to engage, much appreciated. But you guys can also find all of my work on clutchpoints.com, constant news, updates, analysis, articles every day. Follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _ live game tweets, press conference clips. I put all my work up on there. So if you don't already, go check me out on that. But 6 games left in the regular season. The Nets draft lottery position is all but solidified. We're really going to be moving into some free agency talk, some draft talk, some trade talk, all the offseason stuff. I'm going to have some good content on all that coming back, hopefully with some really interesting guests. So I'll provide coverage, all of that and more here on Believe in Nets. Talk to you guys soon.